So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in the Line 16 Improvement Science series, a series that we're looking that will support the Line 16 program, just giving a few hints and tips on some of the background to improvement, not necessarily focus too much on tools, more around the science that sits behind how we do our improvement work. This month, I'm going to hand over the reins to a good friend and colleague, Spencer Humphrys, who huge amount of knowledge in background around improvement science as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to you, Spencer.
Thanks, Nick. Sorry, having an issue taking myself off mute. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through a few things today. We're going to kind of canter through a reasonably quick pace. So feel free to jump in or ask questions as we go. I can't see the chat, so I can't see hands coming up either, so do speak up. I've added a few links in back of the document that we'll send around afterwards. And if any of you want to speak to me or your improvement manager about any more of this afterwards, just give us a shout. So problem definition and kind of root cause analysis stuff. Whenever I think of this, I always think of this quote by Albert Einstein. He said, if I've got an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes figuring out what the problem or the actual question was, and then only 5 minutes thinking about the answer. And this kind of goes against the grain for most people and most places, and particularly the NHS, where something goes wrong and we jump straight into solutions. And we don't necessarily spend the time to think about what are we actually trying to solve here. So one of the things that I always say to my system is that good root cause analysis is all about leadership. And you can kind of take from these pitches what you want and see what kind of leader that you are or that you're working with. But it is about having time to do the right things. So what we often see, particularly in NHS management and NHS leadership, is something goes wrong and then everyone goes all hands to the deck and we go straight into firefighting mode and we fix the issue. And then we quite often find someone to blame. You know, someone didn't book transport, or this didn't happen, or this person didn't turn up on time, or A&E are admitting too many people, or these people are discharging people too slowly. There's normally a blame element to it, and that's just not helpful. And what you can see is it just goes around and around and around in a circle. If you don't fix the issue, the same problem will come up again. It might come up the next day, it might come up a week later, it might come in a different service, but it will come up again. So what we would ideally kind of encourage people to do is just to take the time. So when you fix the problem, it's then about getting into the root cause analysis work, spending the time using the data and the analysis to understand what are the actual problems that you're trying to fix. Now, probably one of the most important things I would say today is even doing really good root cause analysis work, you will always go around that circle. It will always come up again. It might come up in a different place. It might come up less. I guess the way that I would encourage you to think about this would be to think of it kind of like an upside down tornado or like a triangle. Without the root cause analysis work, you're going to be spinning round and around, constantly going around the same issues. The more you do this stuff, the frequency of the issues and the impact of the issues will reduce and reduce and reduce. But no matter how good you get, there will always be problems, and that's fine. That's part of continuous improvement, part of continuous learning of how to always get better. So I'm sure there's probably more than one of you is sat there thinking, that's great, but we just don't have the time. It's too busy, ops is crazy, there's always stuff going on, there's always stuff that needs to be done. We just don't have the time, or I don't have the time, or we're not given the time. I suppose my challenge to everyone, whenever anyone says anything like this, and funny enough, we were just talking about this on a call I've just got off, is the way that we think about time, if you're really investing in continuous improvement, needs to change. So when you think about, in your ward, in your department, in your organisation, how much time over the past year have you spent talking about or dealing with people who weren't discharged because transport didn't turn up, or they turned up late, or you didn't have a key safe, or PCOs weren't ready on time, or complaints about communication, or medication errors, or near misses? You know, when you start adding up all of this time, that's a huge amount of time. And just to put this into perspective, I'm a numbers person. So for every one member of full-time staff that wastes 15 minutes a day, now that could be, when we talk about wasting, in this perspective, it's dealing with an issue that you dealt with yesterday, or dealing with an issue that you deal with every week, because every Monday's rubbish and the same thing happens. 15 minutes a day over a course of a year is 1.5 weeks. So for every 3 members of staff, that's a month of time. Most organisations get about the kind of 3, 4, 5,000. So for every 1,000 members of staff that waste 15 minutes a day. Now, in the broader sense, that could be with equipment that doesn't work, or treatment rooms that aren't properly stocked, or having to walk down the corridor to get to a printer because you're not allowed one in your office, those kind of things. Every 1,000 members of staff, that's 58,000 hours of capacity that you lose every year. So when we talk about we don't have the time to do root cause analysis, you absolutely do. But it's about thinking differently about how do you use your time. It very much is that kind of the old saying of sometimes you need to slow down to speed up. So I'm not going to talk too much about error and human errors, but there's just a couple of bits to think about that I want you to think about here, and you can have a look at this later. When things go wrong, as I said earlier, what people often do is they see the error and they jump straight down into this violation box. They think it's gone wrong because someone doesn't care, or you know, that person, they're just a bad employee, or they're rubbish at discharging people, or they're really lazy, or they're always late. You know, people quite often jump straight to that part, but realistically, that's very, very rare. It's very rare that, you know, there is actually sabotage or there's exceptional violation of the process. Normally, things happen because of all of these other issues, all of these other failures. And without doing root cause analysis, without digging into the depths, what we'll quite often get stuck on is either in that violation mindset where we quite often, if something goes wrong, we will blame it on the person rather than blaming it on the circumstance. But if we do something wrong, we never say we're a bad person. We say it was because of the circumstance, it was because of the situation that we were in. And so there is that thing to think whenever you're doing this stuff, humans are not logical. We don't think in the right way, and there are reasons for that. Now, root cause analysis, if you haven't seen it, there is this Swiss cheese model. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but if you haven't, what it talks about is errors, issues, accidents, problems happen because of a system of failures. It's almost never because of one element. But without root cause analysis, what we would do is we would look at this accident in the bottom left and say, it happened because of this unsafe act. It happened because of this one issue. But when we look at the system, there are all bits behind it that have failed. And if you're only trying to fix one of the later parts of the cheese, you're never gonna control the issue. You're gonna keep getting the same issue. You're gonna keep having those crap Mondays. You're gonna keep having whatever you don't want to have. So I'm just going to talk through a few techniques. There are loads of techniques that you can do. I've put a few down here. There are more. I'm just going to talk about a few really simple ones. I'm probably going to talk for about another 5 minutes or so, and then open it up to have a chat with people. I thought that would be more helpful than me just blabbering on at you for half an hour. So if you haven't done root cause analysis before, the most simple approach is something called the 5 whys analysis. And it is as simple as asking why 5 times. Now, 5 is a kind of an arbitrary number. You might have to ask it 6 or 7 times. You might get there after 3 or 4. But what it is about trying to encourage people to think beyond what comes first to mind. So humans suffer from something called the availability bias. And what this means is we will make decisions or we will make judgments based on what comes most easily to our mind, what is most available. So if we've just been dealing with, let's say, social services delays, or if the social services delays are the things that get fed back to us most frequently, when we are asked what the problem is, that's what we're going to say. We're not going to think of all of the other little bits because they're not quite so easy to remember. So when doing a 5 whys analysis, you start with a question and then you just ask why, and you keep digging and digging and digging. And eventually you will get to a point where people go, oh, this is how it is, and they'll get really frustrated. And if any of you have got any little kids who ask why about 1,000 times a day, you will kind of understand if you ever try and go down that route with them, you do get to a different level of understanding. So I've just put up a little example here. This is a real life example of when we did this in acute medical unit. So one of the questions was why don't discharges happen before 10? I won't go through it. What you can see though is that second point, and this is something that I was never told when I was taught this, but when you're doing a 5 whys analysis, chances are that at one point you will have 2 different whys. When we said why doesn't the ward round finish until 1 o'clock in the afternoon on an assessment unit, there were 2 main reasons. One being that they didn't start the ward round till nearly 10 o'clock, and one being that every patient review took ages. So when you're doing it, do allow yourself to come up with a few different root causes. It's very, very rare that there will be a single cause of a system failure. So you do need to be looking to try and identify a few. So allow yourself to broaden that out as you're going down it. This, I think, as I said earlier about the leadership element, root cause analysis is very much about your local leadership and your local culture. So there will be certain wards, certain areas, certain people where if you try and take this kind of approach, they will take it very negatively. They will feel like you're challenging them personally. So it's up to you how you manage that. The second approach that we use a lot in ECIST is something known as the Pareto principle. So if any of you have heard of the kind of saying that the 80% of work will take 20% of your time, and the final 20% will take 80% of your time, that's the Pareto principle. And again, what I mentioned earlier about the availability bias, if we were talking about flow, and we would say to people, why do you have this cohort of really long length of stay patients? Why is your number of over 21 days so long? People will quite often say, oh, social services delay or safeguarding, and that's the availability bias coming through. That's them talking about what is most easily come to mind. And quite often people will stop there and they'll say, well, we've got 6 or 7 issues and social services are our biggest problem. But what the Pareto principle says to do is keep digging. Take your 5 whys approach and dig into some of the reasons behind delays. And what you'll find is that there are more that sit behind it. And as you keep digging through your 5 whys, in this example, what you can see is, yes, there are issues with social services and x-rays and so on, but every single patient was delayed by CT. So when you use a Pareto chart, and what a Pareto chart does, it just looks at how many times an issue, an error, a problem has come up, and then looks at that in terms of the total percentage of delays, problems, errors. Now, what you can see in this chart, if this is a real chart, most people complain about social services and they talk about how difficult and slow safeguarding is. But if you fix those 2, actually overall it's going to have very little impact. Whereas the CT delays affected 50% of all delays. So if you're going to fix something, you would start here. You would start in CT delays. Now the thing with the Pareto principle is you will always have a number 1. So if we were to improve CT processes and bring that down to only affecting, let's say, 2 people, what we would then see is social services would get a promotion and that would become our biggest. So it's a way of constantly refining and making sure that we're working on the biggest issue, the thing that affects most people, most often, most of the time. And if you work there, actually you'll find you get far more impact for far less work. The next bit just to talk about is something called a fishbone diagram. I do realise I'm flying through this at pace, so do interrupt me or ask questions at the end. So a fishbone diagram, most people would have used, and it's just a different way of looking at things. So what you do here is you come up with your issue. So for example, waiting times are too long in outpatients. And then you work with your team to say, right, well, what are all of the reasons, whether that's an environmental reason, an equipment reason, a people reason, a method reason. But there are other bits that you can put on there, but these are the 4 most commonly used in healthcare. And say, well, what contributes to it? So, it could be around staff not available, people arriving late, treatment rooms not being properly stocked, not enough treatment rooms, waiting rooms being too far. And hopefully what you're beginning to see in your head again, kind of going through these, is a lot of them are very similar. But more than that, you can use 2 or 3 of these different techniques in the same analysis to help you look at the same problem in multiple different ways to really find what that core problem is that you need to solve. The final one, which is disappeared from here actually, which is not helpful, would be process mapping. I don't know where it's disappeared to. I'll add it in when we send the slides around. So process mapping is really, really helpful, and far more helpful than I think people often give it credit for. So I'm just going to show you on a different screen an example of how process mapping can help you view your issue and identify the root causes a little bit differently. So 1 second. Okay. So process mapping is most often used for process improvement, but actually process mapping has got as much, or in my experience, actually it's got more of a role in root cause analysis than in just general process improvement itself. So this is an example of something that we did at Bedford a few weeks ago. You won't be able to see the detail, don't worry. But what this looked at is looking at all of the steps within the process. So their problem was that, and it's probably a problem that you all face at certain times, they don't have enough staff to do the work. They are completely overwhelmed. Things get missed, things get dropped, things aren't acted on quick enough. They've got patients who are staying in hospital longer than they should. And all of these issues, they were kind of saying, well, what do we do? How do we fix it? So through process mapping, what we looked at is these 4 green boxes. These were the only steps in the process that added any value to patients. All of the rest of the steps, and you can see there are far more steps later on in the amber and red that don't add value. So part of their problem is they're doing tons and tons of work that, from a patient's perspective, they really don't need to do. What they were able to do from this is to dig in and say, where are our biggest problems? And what they found was that by the way that they worked, and by the way that they did a lot of things very manually and lots of handwriting stuff and not using computer systems, they had created a system that was really inefficient, required tons and tons of rework and forms being sent back and things being lost and people having to move around. And what they could say from this by the end of it is that, broadly speaking, this pathway would work perfectly for 5 out of 100 patients. So for those other 95 patients, their discharge would be delayed for purely process reasons. And this is just a different way of them having a look and saying, what is our problem? What's the root cause of our issues? So that was a very, very fast run through of a few of the ways that you can do root cause analysis and you can dig into the detail. I wanted to stop now to give kind of 5-10 minutes for if there are any questions or comments or anything else that could be helpful, either for you personally or that we could do as ECIST in the overall Alliance 16 program that might help you out in your job. So over to you.
Thanks, Spencer. That was really helpful. I think some great hints and tips there about something we stress a lot about. Take your time. We have got time for improvements. You need to get to the root cause, understand the issue. So thank you for that. So any questions in the chat? I can pick up in the chat and relay them out to Spencer. Anybody want to put their hand up and ask any questions of the the detail that Spencer's spoken about. We can go into a bit more detail. We've got 10 minutes. Anything you want to draw out, Spencer? Any other additional pieces you want to elaborate on?
I don't think so. I think so when we send the slides around later, I'll add in the process mapping part. I guess one thing that I always say to all of my sites and systems is there is no right way to do any of this. You need to find what works for you personally, what works for your ward, department, area, what works culturally, what fits in with how people think. And I suppose the other way of thinking about this, and I'm sure the kind of things that Nick said all along, is it's all about continuous improvement. The first time you do it, you will do it wrong. You know, I'm at the point of doing it for my 200th time and we still do it wrong, and that's fine. But it's important to kind of acknowledge that up front, that all of this is about a learning journey. You will find a root cause, you will fix it, and then the issue will happen again next week and you'll find out it wasn't actually the root cause. But that is fine in itself. Yeah,
it's so important, that learning, isn't it? Always learn from those. I know we've talked about failure a lot on these sessions, about learning from failure, about picking yourself back up again, go again, learn what went well, what didn't go well, and to do that, you need to get to the root cause, because if you only ever treat the superficial cause, you're focusing on the wrong thing. Janice, I'm going to bring you in. You got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and hi, Spencer. Nice to see you. Just a really question, because I really get that, Spencer, about the you identify what works for your unit, and I know I've done these sort of things before, and you kind of start with one tool and you go, it's not really helping me, kind of, the 5 whys isn't working, let me ditch that and let me go to the Fishbone. But I don't know if you've got any sort of tips or thoughts for people around which tool's best for which things, or is it a bit of trial and error, or the one you feel most confident with?
I think it's probably a mixture of all of them. It's what you feel comfortable with. It's what the people you're doing it with will find it most helpful. I think probably the biggest tip I could give for all of this stuff is just to remember that everyone sees the world differently and everyone processes things differently. So if you are ever trying to do a root cause analysis, however you're going to do it, my biggest bit of advice would be do it somewhere really open. So if you're doing it, let's say we're doing a root cause analysis in a ward, what I would recommend you do is you find a bit of wall where everyone walks past every day and do it there. Stick the bits up on the wall and allow people to contribute at different times, because there'll be people who can't make the meeting, or there'll be people who join the meeting but need to go away and have a think. That is the best way to do it, because the root cause analysis in itself is only part of it. Even if you get the root cause perfectly, the bigger part is that feeling of ownership and that understanding of how that journey's gone. So do it somewhere public, allow people to get involved. Don't keep it to, you have to be in this meeting or you have to email me. Open it up for feedback in all these different ways. And then even if you don't get the right root cause, just the involvement and engagement of staff will give you a big push down that continuous improvement journey.
Thanks, Janice. I think picking up on the 5 whys, it becomes more of a mindset, doesn't it, Spencer? More than a formal process to go through. I think sometimes it feels a little bit awkward the first time you do it, as Spencer was saying, and you go through those steps, and the recipient is like, will you stop asking me why? But there's potentially you end up going down a bit of a rabbit hole. But it's more about the mindset that you get into, the habit and the practice of just thinking in those terms, not just taking the first answer. So, okay, well, why did that happen and why did that happen? And that's where it becomes a bit more familiar, just part of the continuous improvement culture and mindset that you get into. And that's what I like to see when teams start to ask themselves those kind of questions, rather than necessarily go through the formal structure of asking those the detailed questions. So thank you for that, Janice. We've got a couple more minutes left. Anybody want to pick anything up with Spencer? So as usual, we'll share the slides and we've got the recording. So, Sharon's coming. Sharon, do you want to ask a question to Spencer?
Not a question, it's just to bear on what he said just now in answer to Janet, that many times we inadvertently exclude everybody who has contact or engagement or some form of interaction with that process or the outcome or somewhere along the links. So it's really good what you said, Spencer, with regards to allowing as many voices who are engaging with or interacting with whatever it is to have a little bit to say, not to assume that the end is as is because, after the 5 whys, etc. But everybody who's got some sort of connection or some sort of interaction with it may be able to add another perspective that we've not yet thought of. Yeah.
Thanks, Sharon. So as I say, we will share the recording and the slide set. John, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for that, Nick. So Spencer, is there any kind of scenarios where you maybe wouldn't be engaging with a system or a team? So, for example, like years ago, we did some work with Harvard University, and one of the great learning from Harvard was they said, focus on the ones that get it. Don't waste your time on the ones that don't. And more often than not, we target our improvement resource towards those that are struggling the most. When fundamentally, there are some cultural, challenges in those organisations, which means, it doesn't stick. Do you have a view on maybe the limited resource we've got around improvement and how we target that going forward?
Nothing helpful. Sorry. I think I guess it really is down to your local culture. I think you're right. There are 2 camps, aren't there? You either take your limited improvement resource and you work with the people that get it, and you will get improvements. I suppose that's true to a point, but I guess if they get it already, they're probably going to be doing it already. I suppose my personal view is people aren't obstructive or difficult for no reason. They will be pissed off and they will be not engaging, and there will be a reason. So I guess some of my biggest wins in ECIST have been when I've gone to those people who are traditionally not involved, the people who people go, don't talk to that A&E consultant, he's too difficult. But actually just going to them and just speaking to them like a normal person, just going and going, look, what pisses you off? What doesn't work? What is going on? And actually I found some of my most engaged people are the people who are traditionally forgotten about. I guess it comes partly down to the leadership approach of how do you want to drive continuous improvement. So a lot of people will say we have a specific issue, for example, long length of stay. So therefore we need to fix long length of stay, but consultant A doesn't care about long length of stay, so we're just going to ignore him. That's the kind of the short-term approach to improvement and not the systematic approach to continuous improvement. So taking the more strategic approach, it would be saying, well, actually, long length of stay is an issue right now, but there'll be a new target next year. So let's go and have a chat to consultant A who doesn't really care and say, what's on your mind? What do you think needs to be improved? And what they think might need to be improved might have absolutely nothing to do with the strategic aims. But if you can get them on board and help them fix what their problems are, what is going to be the bigger impact in terms of that local culture and that local approach to improvement? So I guess it's that balance, isn't it, between your short-term needs versus your long-term, your 3 to 5 year strategy of culture engagement and improvement. There is, sorry, just really quickly, just on that final point, I realise we have hit 1 o'clock. I've put a link into it in the slides anyway, but if you have a group of particularly disengaged or negative people, there is a process you can use called a project pre-mortem, which is really, really helpful, which is essentially where you bring them all together and you come up with a fake news headline of, so in a year's time, so let's say, in your local system, the Daily Mail headline is that have killed 15 patients because they spent all their time doing long length of stay reviews and didn't actually do the work. And then you put it back to your teams and say, tell me every single reason that would happen. Tell me every reason that this project won't work, that this program won't deliver. that we're just not going to make any difference. And what it will allow, it creates a really constructive environment for everyone to be as negative as they want to be, but in a really positive way. That's a good way to help rule out the negativity in a good way and flip it on its head and do something good with it afterwards. So I'd recommend you have a look at that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Spencer. We will share those slides and that link when we've got them, and the video will post that as well. So thanks very much for joining this session. Spencer, thanks very much for taking the time to spend half an hour with us. Really appreciate that. We'll be back. I'll be back on the 20th of July, picking up on many of the subjects that Spencer's been talking about today around how to develop a continuous improvement mindset. But for now, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next month. Bye, all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.